Welcome to chapter 5. In this chapter, we'll talk about system acquisition, which this is a process that the IT team is heavily involved in. And oftentimes our members of our clinical team can be involved, but not necessarily every member of the clinical team. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance of ensuring that we have the right players involved when we start to think about this topic. Okay, so we'll talk through kind of what we go through and the stages of the system development life cycle, and the pros and cons of the different ways to go about it, and how we solicit some of that information and how we make the best decision over what system we're going to actually end up adopting. We'll also talk about kind of some of the things that can go wrong, and there are many. This is a very complex process, and I'll say, in the years that I've done this, I've never had a time where I could say everything went perfect. So we don't evaluate our success based on if we ran into problems. It's not a matter of if we run into problems, it's when we run into problems. So we define system acquisition as the process that occurs from the time the decision is made to select a new system, or in many cases, replace an existing system, until the time a contract has been negotiated and signed. Okay. This can take days. This can take years. Usually it doesn't take years. I'll say more often than not, it's in many months, because you have to give vendors an opportunity to respond to your request. And we'll cover more of that as we move forward. But a major component of this is the SDLC, the Systems Development Lifecycle. Now, I'll caveat and say, you've probably likely by now heard the buzzword Agile. Agile is very much getting popular in healthcare IT projects as well as it is in other projects. That said, to some extent, the SDLC process is still followed just to a pretty loyal degree of magnitude, if you will. So we start with the planning phase and analyzing our existing system, thinking about what we need from the new system, and then we design the new system. That means we pick a vendor, we pick an Epic, a Cerner, a McKesson, a GE, and then we have to go and we have to customize that system to meet our needs. Implementation means we're actually going in and configuring that system. And then, like I said in a prior lecture, the support and evaluation phase follows after that. Okay. To get this done, one of the first things that happens when we decide there is a need for a new system is usually the CIO coupled with the CMIO will define a project steering committee. Okay. And their job is to oversee and guide the project. So they are involved in the coordination, the management of all aspects around the acquisition process. Okay. There will be a project manager appointed. If we think of all the skills we expect out of a project manager, from my time as a project manager, I would say the most crucial is what I agree with the text here. It is an effective communicator. My years as a project manager on these IT projects, when something went wrong, we could always trace it back to a failure in communication. Many times on my part, to be fair. You have to have strong organizational and leadership skills. You have to be excellent at managing time, working with multiple resources, competing interests, but also you have to have the respect of the organization. Okay. We got to put together a strong team, and this is where it gets important. The text does a really good job here. It says at least one person has to be knowledgeable about IT. I'll be honest, when I used to do this early on in my career, we staffed the project with a whole bunch of IT people and very few clinical people. What we need is representation from everywhere. And in my early days, when we would pull these together and make turn the project on, turn the software on, we would constantly hear from the clinical staff, it's obvious you didn't consult anyone from my area on this. And hard message to hear, but they were usually right. Okay. So what does that committee do? They need to define the objectives and the scope of the project. So, and this, I can't stress this enough. The book doesn't really drive this home as important as it needs to be. When you're dealing with these large scale projects, involves millions and millions of dollars in some cases, and lots of moving pieces, lots of moving parts, lots of competing interests. It's very, very important that before the project even starts, we all agree what our objectives are and what the scope is. Such that what I used to make my clients do was sign what I called a scope alignment document. And I would love to tell you that this was due to just brilliant insight on my part that, I came up with this idea just, because I'm a genius. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. Truth be told, what happened was, did a big project that lasted 9 months. The project was worth several $1,000,000. And when the project came to an end, the CIO at the hospital that we did the project for refused to pay us. And his rationale was, well, that's not what I agreed we were going to do. And got our attorneys involved, got their attorneys involved. And the statement finally was, well, Dave, where do you have it in writing that this is exactly what would be done? And I said, well, I've got some emails. And they said, no, that's not binding. So from that point on, lesson learned, I would make whoever was in charge of the project on the hospital side sign off and say, we will agree this project is done when the following has been met. And we also agree that that's the last milestone of the project and that you will cut payment to my organization. Okay. So that committee is also responsible for looking at what vendors we're going to work with, determining the goals of the system, and then go through and prioritize what the system requirements are. Okay. Every system out there on the marketplace does not meet every need of every single organization. And sometimes that's what we call a showstopper, right? I absolutely have to have this functionality. Sometimes it's more of it would be nice to have this functionality. Other times it's like, we can definitely live without this. Okay. So we need to do things like conduct surveys, focus groups, get to know our user population, figure out where the pain points are. We need to have the vendors demo the products. The other thing that is very popular in this space is what we call reference site visits. So that's the last bullet point here, where you would ask that vendor, hey, do you have anyone that can be a reference site for you? Meaning you want to go to that, in this case, that hospital, and you want to see that system alive and in production and see what it looks like and see, is this really what they're promising you? Is that what they deliver? So once you get to that point, you want to develop a RFP or an RFI. So request for proposal or request for information. And I'll tell you, in this industry, more often than not, it's request for proposal. And the reason why is, if you see here how the text defines these two, this is accurate. An RFI is shorter, it's less formal. It just doesn't include as much. And a drawback to it not including as much and being less formal is it's usually not as legally binding should you encounter an issue. So RFPs, if you've never written one, are incredibly long, laborious, and painful. You need someone that has an incredibly strong attention to detail, where they have to detail out a myriad of things that are very important to the project. What else does the committee do? They look at all the acquisition options. And an important point now is this debate of, do we have what's called on-prem, meaning I have all of my infrastructure on site, or am I going to go with cloud hosted? Cloud hosted in the healthcare space offers a great deal of benefit. And again, I don't think that the text fully expands on this, but given that I worked in a cloud data center, I think it's I get a little passionate about it, if you will. It's worthwhile to talk about. One thing that people that don't work in healthcare don't tend to consider is IT infrastructure takes up a lot of space. Hospitals are typically square footage poor. They don't have a lot of space. And if you don't believe me, talk to anyone that works in health IT on the hospital side. Their offices are not typically in the most glamorous of places. Oftentimes you'll find that the IT department is in a double wide trailer in the back parking lot. Other times you'll find that the IT department is in the basement. My favorite is the ones that are in between the morgue and the laundry room. Because all of your premium square footage in the hospital is used for patient care areas, which is where your revenue's at. So if we can contract with a vendor to move our IT infrastructure, all of those server stacks, if we can move those somewhere else, that number one, frees up space. Number two, it frees up people resources. I now rely on the vendor to manage those IT resources, not my internal staff. If you go to a major metropolitan area where there's a lot of hospitals, like Kansas City, for example, if you have a data center person, let's say Citrix is a popular technology used in health IT in the cloud/data center space. If you have someone in-house at your hospital that's really good at administering Citrix technology, they are constantly trying to get poached away from other large health organizations within the city. So it's tough to keep and maintain talent. So a lot of hospital systems have elected to let the vendor carry that risk. So let the vendor be responsible for that. Let them figure out how to hire and maintain those people. And all I have to do is write a check every month. Okay. This offers us a lot of benefits. The other thing it gives us when we go with the cloud option is the ability for rapid growth. If all of a sudden I need to expand my servers, I need 10 more. If I have that on site at the hospital, I got to figure out where to put them. I got to figure out who's going to configure them. If I'm in a data center somewhere that's managed by my vendor, I just click a couple buttons, sign a new contract, and I've got more server space. They handle all that. The last area why we tend to resort towards cloud computing is reduction of risk. If like I mentioned, we're a lot of times the only place we have space for infrastructure is in the basement. Okay, it's prone to flooding. The example I gave you where the IT shop is right next door to the laundry room, those big industrial dryers catch fire all the time, so you have risk of fire. So it's just so much easier to let the vendor carry that risk. So we're seeing more and more organizations go this path. Okay, so once we make that decision, cloud versus in-house, we then look at those vendor proposals. We have to create a fair evaluation criteria on how we evaluate those proposals. Years ago, when the Department of Defense put out an RFP and said, we're looking for someone to come in and replace our system. The two vendors that were the finalists for that bid was Cerner and Epic. Cerner got the bid. Epic later came back and filed suit against it and said it was not a fair evaluation criteria. We were not fairly evaluated, and it got hung up in the court system for a long time. Okay. Next, you have vendor demos. I'll say it's important there to let many people within the organization, maybe people even outside of that committee, view those demos, as it's very important for them to get to see what the potential options are. So we analyze the vendors, we do that cost benefit, and then we prepare a summary. Okay. More than likely what happens is that final decision has to be done at the board level, because you're spending, in most organizations, a spend of over $10,000 has to be approved by the board of directors of the hospital system. So you pass that information with a recommendation up to the board, and they make the final decision based on your analysis. Then comes the contract negotiations. Now, I'll pause just for a minute on contract negotiations, because this one's interesting. As laws have changed over the years, this is kind of taken on a different light. But I know in my early days of doing this, I was not a salesperson, but at this point, it was very common for salespeople within those big EHR vendors to spend an exuberant amount of money wining and dining the decision makers of a given health system. So, again, I wasn't involved in this, but I've heard stories of, having suites at, football stadiums and concert halls, and, filet mignon dinners, and, $400 bottles of wine and all that stuff, just to convince them to sign a contract. So it gets pretty heated. Okay. So with that, we're managing a project. When I first started doing this, there was one tool and one tool only that we used. It wasn't up for discussion, and it was Project Manager, the Microsoft project rather. It was clunky. It wasn't very easy to use. It was problematic. Now there is a whole bunch of different tools out there. Some of the vendors even have some of their own homegrown project management tools. Some people, believe it or not, are still using the very, very simple, somewhat dated method of just using a spreadsheet. And if done correctly, that can work as well. So what are some of the things that can tend to go sideways when we get to this stage in the game? We don't do a good job sometimes of managing the vendor access to the organizational leadership, letting them talk to the right people to get the right information. We sometimes don't keep this whole process very objective. And let me give you a good example here. Even if we have a system in place already, let's say we have an Epic system, and we're trying to make the decision of, do we renew our contract with Epic for 5 more years, or do we go with its competitor, Cerner? We still go through that RFP process. We still get vendor demos from both sides, and we still go through everything I just covered in the past prior 11 slides. But we might have a preconceived bias towards Epic, right? If we're already on an Epic system. So sometimes that's hard. Other times it's not. So that's what we mean there. Sometimes we go overboard on the RFP. More often than not, I find that there's not enough detail in the RFP. Okay. We got to get the leadership team involved. But I'd stress more importantly than that is the users. Be sure the users have bought into this. Be sure they're on board. Be sure they've seen all the demos. Be sure they've been given all the information. Okay. And then, as I said, negotiations can get a little grueling. Like I said, this was something I was never involved in on the front end. As I said, I've never been a salesperson, but I would always go back and review the contracts afterwards. And it was interesting, some of the concessions that got made in contracts simply just to close a deal. In some cases, signing a contract that would result in the vendor losing money for the first couple of years just to be able to capture a key client in a significant market. Okay. So we got to think about the architecture. We got to think about a few key components: the architecture, the platform, and the infrastructure. And, we'll talk more about this in later chapters, but this really is the bedrock for the direction the organization goes in terms of its IT platform. Okay. And like I said, we'll mention this more in later chapters, but things to think about. So this is interesting. When we get to this slide, and we think about integration. Okay. When you talk to people in health IT, they'll constantly say, oh, we're a GE shop, or we're an Epic shop, or we're a Cerner shop. Does that mean every single piece of their technology within the organization is from that given vendor? Almost not. It's very, very rare. What most people don't know is if you go into your normal hospital system, if they say we're, quote, an Epic shop, is what that usually means is they are a Epic EHR. That does not necessarily mean that that's what they use for radiology, pharmacy, laboratory, scheduling, dietary, the list goes on and on and on. For example, when I was still at Cerner, I had a pretty large client that was they did a lot of academic laboratory research, and they used Cerner's lab software, which was voted, I talked in a prior lecture about KLAS. Lab was voted Cerner's lab software was voted kind of best of breed, that it was, if you wanted good lab software, this is what you had. So this particular client used Cerner for their lab, but they used Epic for their EHR and their pharmacy and several other key components. So we show up to convert the lab software to the newest software release. And of course, we're wearing Cerner shirts, and it baffled everybody that didn't work in the lab because they couldn't understand what Cerner was doing there if they used Epic. So best of breed is very common, right? So we'll take an Epic EHR. We might want a Cerner lab system. We want a McKesson pharmacy system. We want a GE radiology system. Okay. Like I said, very few organizations use a monolithic approach, where that means we use one. We're a shop of one. Okay. So the important thing, though, is how do we pull it all together? Okay. They've got to interface within the organization. Okay. So we've got to have easy access to Clearly Flow. And we do that via system integration. Okay. So I mentioned HL7 in a prior lecture. We use HL7 to ensure, the example I just gave, it was Epic EHR and a Cerner lab. We use an HL7 interface to send the lab results out of Cerner into the Epic EHR. So when a doctor wants to view a CBC result, he or she doesn't have to log into two different systems. So that's how we kind of pull it all together. So in summary, that's kind of the system acquisition process. Talked about the, project committee, how we make it all happen, and then again, some of those blunders that can potentially take place. And this kind of sets the stage for that next chapter. So that concludes this chapter. Please let me know if you have any questions.